200 Apache warriors surrounded the cabin, but the chief's daughter stared lovingly at the cowboy. Have you ever held death in your hands and chosen to breathe life back into it, knowing that mercy might be the knife that cuts your own throat? Have you ever stood at the threshold of your own grave and invited the digger inside for coffee? The moon was a silver sickle cutting through storm clouds when she came to him, her blood-painting abstract prayers in the snow. Not the dramatic arrival of a warrior, but the stumbling collapse of something wild that had run itself nearly to death. The way her fingers clutched the cabin's doorframe spoke of a will that refused surrender, even as her body betrayed its limits. Snow gathered in her black hair like stars fallen to earth, each flake a small death melting into warmth. Samuel Cross had lived 3 winters in this place the Mexicans called Valle del Fantasma, Ghost Valley. And in those 1,000 days of solitude, he'd trained himself to wake at the slightest irregularity. The scratch of her fingernails against wood was soft as a mouse in the walls, but it pulled him from sleep as surely as gunfire. His hand moved to the Whitney rifle beside his bed muscle, memory faster than conscious thought before his mind registered what his ears were telling him. This was not the sound of attack, but of collapse. Broken Ridge, Arizona Territory, February 1882. The borderlands where 3 worlds collided: Apache homeland, Mexican frontier, American expansion, and created a wound that wouldn't heal. Here in this contested space, Sam had built his exile 1 log at a time, mortaring the walls with the paste of his own guilt. Through the frosted window, he saw her. Comment 5 if you're drawn to these tales of the frontier. And don't forget to subscribe to hear where forbidden love leads when 3 cultures collide. Our stories appear every week, bringing you the untold romances of the Wild West. Aiyana, though he didn't know her name, yet knelt in his dooryard like a prayer made flesh. Her deerskin dress, once decorated with careful beadwork, hung in tatters. The geometric patterns that should have told the story of her clan were obscured by blood, so much blood that in the moonlight it looked black as spilled ink. But her eyes held him with an intensity that suggested this was no random arrival. She had chosen this door, this moment, this man to witness what might be her last breath. "Please," she said in English, the word frosted with pain. Then, as if remembering herself, she repeated it in Apache, then Spanish. 3 languages for one desperate need. Sam dropped the rifle and caught her as she pitched forward, her weight, nothing and everything at once. She was burning with fever, yet shivering with cold, that terrible contradiction that meant the body was fighting a war it might not win. Up close, he could see the bullet wound in her shoulder, a dark rose blooming through leather and flesh. But worse were the signs of hard riding, the foam of exhaustion at her mouth's corners, the way her legs trembled like a newborn foal's. He carried her inside, laid her on the buffalo robe near his fire. The flames painted her face in amber and shadow, revealing features that were classically Apache yet uniquely hers. High cheekbones that could cut glass, a mouth set in determination, even unconscious scars along her jaw that spoke of previous battles survived. Working by firelight, Sam cut away the ruined dress with the careful precision of a man who'd seen too many battlefield wounds. The bullet had passed through, thank God, but the exit wound was ragged, infected. 3 days old, maybe 4. She'd been riding with this injury, pushing through pain that would have felled most men he'd known. As he cleaned the wound with grain alcohol, she stirred, eyes fluttering open. For a moment, confusion clouded them, then sharpened to alertness. Her hand moved quick as a snake to the knife at her belt, but Sam had already removed it, along with the 2 others hidden in her moccasins. "Easy," he said, hands raised to show empty palms. "You're safe." She studied him with eyes dark as the spaces between stars. "I know who you are," she said in clear, precise English that surprised him. "Samuel Cross, the hermit of Ghost Valley, the one who speaks to horses in their own language and leaves food for coyotes. You've been watching me for 2 months. No shame in the admission, just fact. My father required it. Your father, Chief Kuruk of the Tonto Apache." She tried to sit up, gasped at the pain, fell back. "He sent me to determine if you were a threat. I told him you were not. I told him you were." She paused, searching for words different. Sam continued working on her wound, packing it with clean cloth. Different? How? You take only what you need. You read the land like my people do through tracks and wind, and the way ravens circle. You burn sage at dawn, though you're not Apache. You carry death in your past like a visible shadow, yet you choose not to spread it. Her observations were unsettlingly accurate. Sam had indeed adopted certain Apache customs learned from distant observation and an old Mexican trader who'd lived among them. The sage burning was for his dead, the men he'd led to slaughter at Elkhorn Tavern, the family he'd failed to protect from Comancheros. "Why are you here?" he asked. "Who shot you?" Her face darkened. "Railroad men, Morrison's advance team. They attacked our winter camp 4 days ago, killed 8 warriors, while most were away hunting. I pursued them, but," she gestured at her wound. Morrison. Sam knew the name Josiah Morrison, railroad magnate and land speculator. The man had been circling the territory like a buzzard for months, buying judges, claiming lands, making the desert bleed iron tracks. "He wants the sacred places," Aiyana continued. "The caves where we store our history, the springs we've protected for 20 generations. But more than that, he wants what I carry here." She touched her temple. The knowledge songs, maps sung, not written, every water source, every gold vein, every hidden valley. I am the keeper of these memories for my people. Sam understood then the weight she carried. In Apache culture, certain individuals were chosen as living libraries, memorizing vast amounts of crucial information through songs and stories. If she died, irreplaceable knowledge died with her. "You need a doctor," he said. "No white doctor. They would turn me over to Morrison for bounty. And Apache medicine," she winced, "is 3 days' ride from here." "Then we do this my way," Sam said. "Field surgery. I've done it before. Too many times in too many places where boys bled out calling for their mothers." But he didn't say that. She studied him again with that penetrating gaze. "Why help me? You owe my people nothing." "Maybe that's why," he replied, heating his knife in the fire to sterilize it. "Because I owe nothing, and choose everything." As he worked to clean and properly dress her wound, she drifted in and out of consciousness, speaking sometimes in Apache, sometimes in English. She told him about the attack, how Morrison's men had come at dawn, how they'd specifically targeted the women and elders who held traditional knowledge, how they'd burned the winter stores, poisoned the river with mercury from their mining operations upstream. "They want us weak," she murmured, "dependent, want us to forget the old ways and beg for their flour and blankets." Through the night, Sam tended her. When her fever spiked, he bathed her face with cool water. When she thrashed in delirium, he held her steady, whispering the same meaningless comforts he'd once offered dying soldiers. And when she called out in Apache words he didn't understand but recognized as prayer, he found himself praying too, to a god he'd stopped believing in at Elkhorn Tavern. Dawn came, pale and cold light creeping across the valley like spilled milk. Aiyana's fever had broken her breathing, steadied to something approaching normal. Sam had dozed in his chair rifle across his lap, but woke when she stirred. "You stayed," she said, voice rough but alert. "My cabin," he replied. "Where else would I go?" A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "You know what I mean." He did. He could have ridden to the nearest town, reported her presence, collected whatever reward Morrison was offering. Could have simply put her back in the snow and let nature take its course. Instead, he'd spent the night fighting for the life of a woman whose people had every reason to want him dead. "Your father, Sam," said Chief Karuk. "He'll come looking for you." "Yes," she agreed simply, "with 200 warriors. They'll assume you killed me." That's reassuring. This time her smile was fuller, though it pulled at the stitches he'd carefully placed. "I'll tell them otherwise. If you let me stay until I can ride." "How long?" 3 days, perhaps 4. Sam considered. 3 days harboring the daughter of an Apache chief, while Morrison's men scoured the territory. 3 days that could end with his death from either side. "All right," he said. She looked surprised. "Just like that, I've made worse decisions," Sam replied, thinking of Elkhorn Tavern, of following orders he knew were wrong, of the families left defenseless because he'd taken their protectors to war. "Besides, you need to teach me something. How to survive what's coming." Because if Morrison wants you dead this badly, he won't stop. And when your father arrives with those 200 warriors, I need to be something more than just another white man with blood on his hands." Aiyana studied him for a long moment, seeing past the surface to something deeper. "You're already more than that, Samuel Cross. The question is whether you know it." Outside, snow began falling again, covering their tracks, buying time. But time for what, Sam wondered? For healing, for preparation, or simply for two people from different worlds to recognize something in each other that transcended the boundaries. Others had drawn in blood. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls, shadows that looked sometimes like warriors, sometimes like lovers, sometimes like the ghosts they both carry. The second night brought revelations written in fever dreams, and the honesty that comes when death sits patient in the corner, waiting to see which way the scales tip. Sam had seen enough battlefield infections to know the signs the wound was going septic, despite his careful cleaning. The red streak spreading from the bullet hole traced poison through her veins like rivers on a map. Aiyana's eyes, when lucid, held the knowledge of her own mortality with a calm that both impressed and infuriated him. "There's a plant," she said during one of her clear moments, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. "Desert sage, not the common kind. Purple stems, leaves that smell of rain when crushed. Grows near water, usually in the shadow of ironwood trees." "I know it," Sam said, remembering a cluster he'd seen near Skeleton Spring, 2 hours' ride in good weather. "In this storm, it would take twice that. Boil the roots with salt. Pack the wound with the paste. Apache medicine." She managed a weak smile. "Better than your whiskey and prayer method." He wanted to argue, to insist she'd be fine with conventional treatment, but they both knew better. "Tell me how to identify it exactly. No mistakes." She described the plant in detail, the specific shade of its stems, the way its leaves grew in groups of 5, the white film on its roots that distinguished it from its poisonous cousin. As she spoke, her free hand traced patterns in the air, and Sam realized she was drawing a map showing him the exact route to where the plants grew thickest. "You've been watching me longer than 2 months," he said. 6 months, she admitted. "Since you arrived in the valley, my father wanted you killed immediately. Another white man encroaching on our lands. I convinced him to wait to let me study you first. Why she was quiet so long, he thought she'd drifted off. Then you talked to the dead. I've seen you at dawn facing east speaking names. 23 names, always the same order. Your men from the war." Sam's throat tightened. He'd thought himself unobserved during those private rituals. "My brother does the same," she continued. "Different names, different war. But the same weight, the same need to remember." Her eyes found his. "Men who carry such ghosts carefully are not quick to create more." He prepared to leave, loading his saddlebags with medical supplies in case he couldn't return quickly. Aiyana insisted on teaching him an Apache prayer for safe travel, making him repeat the words until his pronunciation satisfied her. The language felt strange on his tongue, all glottal stops and flowing vowels, but there was a poetry to it that resonated in his chest. "If Morrison's men find you here," he began. "They won't." She pulled a small bag from her belt, wincing at the movement. "Smoke powder. Burn this if anyone approaches. The smoke is invisible to those far away, but will tell my people I'm here and in danger. Your people are 3 days away. Some are." Her smile held secrets. "Others are closer. We have been watching Morrison as carefully as we watched you." The ride to Skeleton Spring tested both Sam and his horse. Snow had become sleet, coating everything in ice that turned the familiar trail treacherous. Twice his mount slipped, nearly sending them both over precipices that hadn't seemed dangerous in better weather. But he pressed on, driven by the image of Aiyana's fevered face and the trust she'd shown in sending him for medicine that might not exist, might have been harvested already, might be buried under snow. He found the ironwood grove she described, though it took precious time to locate the plants beneath the ice. They were exactly as she'd said, purple-stemmed, 5-leafed, with roots that did indeed smell of rain when he pulled them from the frozen earth. He harvested carefully, taking only what was needed, leaving enough for regeneration. It was what she would do, what her people had done for generations. The return journey became a race against time. The storm worsened, turning the world into a white blindness, where direction became guesswork and instinct. Sam navigated by memory, and the occasional glimpse of familiar landmarks, a twisted juniper here, a distinctive rock formation there. His hands went numb inside his gloves, his face burned with cold, but he pushed on. When he finally saw his cabin through the storm smoke still rising from the chimney relief flooded through him, but as he approached he noticed tracks in the fresh snow. Horses, at least 3, circling the cabin recently. The riders hadn't entered the door, remained barred from inside as he'd left it, but they'd been looking searching. Inside he found Aiyana awake and alert, despite her fever, his rifle across her lap. "Morrison's scouts," she said before he could ask. They tested the door, looked through the window. "I stayed still, let them think the cabin was empty. They'll be back." "Yes." She set the rifle aside, her hands shaking with the effort. "Did you find it?" Sam showed her the roots, and her face lit up with genuine joy. "Perfect. You have good eyes, Samuel Cross. Now let me teach you to make medicine." Despite her weakness, she directed him through the preparation process. The roots had to be cleaned, just so boiled, at exactly the right temperature, hot enough to release their properties, but not so hot as to destroy them. Salt added at the precise moment, the mixture stirred counterclockwise, always against the sun for drawing out poison, she explained. The resulting paste smelled sharp and green like spring fighting through winter. "Now comes the painful part," she warned. It was. The paste burned like acid when applied to the wound, and even with her extraordinary self-control, Aiyana couldn't suppress a scream. Sam held her as she convulsed, whispering apologies, feeling her pain echo in his own chest. But within minutes the burning subsided, replaced by a cooling numbness that made her sigh with relief. "It's working," she breathed. "I can feel it fighting the poison." Through that night and the next day, they fell into an unexpected rhythm. Aiyana taught him Apache methods of reading weather signs, how the behavior of insects predicted storms, how the color of sunset revealed tomorrow's winds. Sam shared his knowledge of the land from a surveyor's perspective, water tables, geological formations that indicated mineral deposits, the mathematical precision of mapping terrain. "Your people's maps," Sam said during one of these exchanges, "the sung ones. How do they work?" Aiyana's expression became cautious. Such knowledge was sacred, not shared with outsiders. But after a long consideration, she began to hum a low rhythmic melody that seemed simple until Sam realized each note corresponded to a direction, each rhythm change marked a landmark. "This is just the water song for this valley," she said. "There are hundreds of songs. My grandmother taught them to me as her grandmother taught her. Each generation adds new verses for changes in the land, and Morrison wants these. He wants what they reveal. Gold, deposits we've kept secret, water sources that would let him run rails through lands others think barren, sacred caves full of turquoise and silver." Her face hardened. "He would turn our Mother Earth into a wound that never heals." On the 3rd day, Aiyana's fever broke completely. The infection retreated, leaving her weak but clear-eyed. She could sit up, take solid food, even walk short distances with support. It was then, as they shared a meal of venison stew, that she told him about Morrison's son. "Thomas Morrison died at Elkhorn Tavern," she said, watching his face carefully. "Under the command of Captain Samuel Cross." Sam's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "How do you? Morrison has been hunting you for 3 years. When he learned you were here, in the path of his railroad, it became perfect. He could destroy you and claim our lands in one move." She leaned forward. "The attack on our camp wasn't random. He knew I'd been watching you, knew I'd run here if wounded. He's been playing a longer game than either of us realized." The weight of this revelation settled on Sam like stones. Every decision that had led him here, choosing this valley, building his isolated cabin, even helping Aiyana, had been anticipated, manipulated. "Thomas Morrison was barely 18, Sam said quietly. Lied about his age to enlist. I tried to keep him back from the front lines, but he wanted to prove himself. When the charge came, he stopped, lost in memory. Half my unit died in 13 minutes. Thomas lasted 8 of them, calling for his father the whole time. You held him as he died, Aiyana said. It wasn't a question. I held them all, as many as I could reach. Sam's voice was hollow. 23 boys who trusted me to lead them home. And now their fathers want your blood. Just Morrison, the others. Most understand it was war. Boys die in war. He met her eyes. But Morrison needs someone to blame besides himself for letting his son enlist. That night, as another storm rolled in, they prepared for what both knew was coming. Aiyana was strong enough to travel, but chose to stay to face whatever arrived with Sam. They prepared defenses, ammunition, sorted water barrels, filled sightlines, cleared. But more than that, they prepared each other. Aiyana taught him the Apache way of fighting, using terrain patience, letting the enemy defeat themselves through frustration and overconfidence. Sam showed her military tactics, fields of fire, overlapping coverage, the importance of reserves. We make an unlikely pair of warriors, she said as they worked. The best partnerships usually are unlikely, Sam replied, thinking of how natural it felt to work beside her, how her presence had transformed his exile from escape to something else entirely. As the storm built outside, she told him about the rest of her father's test. When he comes, and he will come with the dawn, he'll want more than just my word that you're trustworthy. Apache justice requires proof through trial. What kind of trial? 3 tests. Truth, courage, and wisdom. Fail any of them. She didn't need to finish, and if I pass, she looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. Then you become something unprecedented. A white man under Apache protection. A bridge between worlds that are breaking apart. Is that what you want? The question hung between them, heavy with implications neither was ready to voice. Outside, wind howled through the valley like the voices of the dead Apache, and soldier alike, all the ghosts this land had swallowed. What I want, Aiyana finally said, is for my people to survive what's coming. Morrison is just the beginning. The railroad brings towns, towns bring more settlers, settlers bring soldiers. We've seen it everywhere else. But maybe, she looked at him, maybe, if we have allies who understand both worlds, we can find a different path. You're asking me to choose a side. I'm asking you to choose a future, she corrected. One where the songs continue, where the springs run clear, where children learn the names of stars in multiple languages. Sam thought of his empty cabin, his daily ritual of naming the dead, the weight of surviving when better men hadn't. Then he looked at Aiyana, wounded but unbroken, fierce but compassionate, carrying the history of a people in her mind and heart. I chose when I brought you inside instead of leaving you in the snow, he said. She smiled then, full and genuine, transforming her face from warrior to woman. I know. I chose too when I came to your door instead of dying alone in the desert. That night, as the storm raged outside, they sat by the fire and shared stories. Not the grand tales of battles and victories, but the small moments that made a life. The first horse Sam had trained, the butterfly migration. Aiyana witnessed as a child, that turned the sky into living gold. His mother's cornbread recipe. Her grandmother's way of reading futures in smoke patterns. When dawn approached, bringing with it the certainty of her father's arrival, they were no longer strangers thrown together by circumstance. They were something new, something neither their peoples nor Morrison could have anticipated. Dawn came like a held breath, the storm having passed in the night, leaving the world crystallized in ice and silence. The snow along Bitter Creek shone like powdered glass, the kind that cuts light into 1,000 unsteady shards. Sam saw them first, dark shapes against the pale landscape, moving with the deliberate patience of predators who knew their prey had nowhere left to run. 200 Apache warriors, exactly as Aiyana had predicted, spreading across the valley in a perfect half-circle that cut off every route of escape. He counted the banners, the faint glint of metal at the ridges, and the silhouettes of riders fanning outward like the ribs of a great living creature. Chief Kuruk rode at their center, tall, in the saddle, a figure carved from the same iron that shaped this land. His horse was black as nightwater, his spear upright, his presence commanding even at a distance. Sam had seen generals and governors, men who wore authority like gaudy medals, but Kuruk's power was older, quieter, and infinitely more dangerous. The authority of a man who had led his people through extinction and still stood unbroken. "He's magnificent," Sam said under his breath. Aiyana, standing beside him, didn't look up. "He's furious," she corrected softly. "Look at his lance. Vertical, not angled, that's war positioning." Her tone carried no fear, only recognition. She had braided her hair in the Apache way, the surviving beads woven near the crown. The rest of her clothes were borrowed, Sam's spare shirt and trousers, but she had transformed them. A strip of deerskin bound her waist, a piece of red cloth tied around her wrist. Despite the exhaustion still clouding her eyes, she stood tall, every inch the chief's daughter. Sam's hand rested on the rifle slung over his shoulder, not for threat, but for habit. "You said they'd come for you," he murmured. "You didn't say they'd bring half the mountain." "If he thinks I'm dead, he'll burn everything to avenge me," she said. "If he sees me alive, then maybe he'll listen." Sam finished. She turned to him. "Let me go first. If they see me alone, it might spare you." "We go together," Sam replied firmly. "Your father needs to see from the start that we stand as equals." Her brow furrowed. "You could die before he believes that." He half smiled. "I could die in my bed of old age too, but that seems less likely every day." For the first time that morning, her lips curved faintly. "You're learning Apache humor, facing death with jokes, just trying to keep up." They stepped out from the shelter of the cabin. The snow cracked beneath their boots, a sound like breaking glass. The moment they cleared the doorway, the valley shifted, 200 warriors drawing their weapons in one motion, the metallic chorus slicing the cold air. Spears lowered, bows lifted. Then Kuruk raised his hand. Stillness fell. He dismounted with the fluid grace of a panther's snow spraying up around his boots. He didn't speak immediately. His gaze moved from his daughter's face to the white man beside her. When he finally spoke, his voice carried across the frozen valley, rich and low, the weight of command in every syllable. Aiyana translated, though she barely needed to. He says, "Daughter, I see you wear the white man's clothes, but stand in the Apache way. Which world claims you now?" Aiyana replied in Apache, her voice clear and proud. Sam caught fragments his own name, the word for healer another, that sounded like honor. "I told him you saved me," she explained. "That you risked Morrison's wrath to help me. That you learned our medicine ways." Kuruk approached slow but certain. The closer he came, the clearer. The resemblance became the same proud jawline, the same eyes that seemed to weigh the world. He stopped a few paces away, scanning Sam's face with an expression both ancient and unreadable. When he spoke again, it was in English, rough but deliberate. "Samuel Cross, the killer of children at Elkhorn Tavern." The words struck like a musket ball. Sam didn't flinch. "Yes. The man who burns sage for enemy dead," Kuruk continued. "They weren't enemies by the time they died," Sam said quietly. "Just boys." Kuruk's eyes flickered, unreadable. "My daughter says you are different from other whites, that you could be trusted to stand with us against Morrison." He stepped closer until their breaths mingled in the frost. "I say a man who led children to slaughter cannot be trusted with anything." Father Aiyana began, but Kuruk silenced her with a raised hand. "You will face the trial," the chief said. 3 tests, as our law demands. Refuse and die now. Fail and die slowly. Pass." His gaze softened a fraction. "We will see what you are made of." Sam exhaled, watching his breath cloud. "I accept." Kuruk nodded once. "The first test is truth. Speak your worst moment. No lie, no omission. My people will know." Sam's mouth felt dry as ash. Truth was the cruelest weapon, and he had carried too much of it for too long. He began quietly. 3 years before the war, I was married. Sarah. We had a son, James, barely 2. His throat tightened. I was away surveying land for the railroad. The same rails that will soon carve through yours. Comancheros raided our homestead. Sarah fought them. They said she hid the boy in the cellar. They took her instead, sold her in Mexico. His voice cracked. By the time I found her, she was gone. Fever, they said. But I knew she'd given up. He drew a shaking breath. I tried to raise the boy alone. I failed. I drank, raged, disappeared inside myself until I gave him to her sister back east. I told myself it was mercy. He looked up, eyes rimmed with frost. He died of scarlet fever 6 months later, without me. The wind held its breath. Aiyana's eyes glistened, but she didn't move. That's why I came west, Sam said. Because the man I was deserved to die, but somehow didn't. Your daughter thinks I can be a bridge between worlds. But I couldn't even bridge the distance between me and my own son. A murmur passed through the warriors, some in disbelief, others in grim understanding. Kuruk stood unmoving. You have spoken truth, he said at last. Now, courage. You will face 5 of my warriors. No weapons, no mercy. You will not win, but you will show how you meet pain. Aiyana's voice rose. Father, no, but Sam had already stripped off his coat. It's fair, he said simply. 5 young warriors stepped forward, each taller, stronger, unscarred by age. They removed their weapons, forming a loose circle. The snow crunched under their bare feet. Kuruk raised his hand. Begin. The first blow came fast, a fist to Sam's ribs that knocked air from his lungs. The second clipped his jaw. He stumbled, caught himself straightened. They didn't fight to kill. They fought to measure. Each strike was a question. What kind of man are you? Sam answered the only way he knew, by rising. Every time they knocked him down, he stood. When his lips split, he spat blood into the snow and faced them again. When one drove a knee into his side, he grunted but did not fall. Minutes bled into eternity. His vision blurred. His body screamed. He was no soldier now, just stubborn flesh refusing to yield. Finally, Kuruk lifted his hand. Enough. The 5 warriors stepped back, chests heaving. Sam swayed but didn't collapse. The ring of men stared at him with new eyes, not affection, not yet, but respect. Kuruk approached. The third test is wisdom. He gestured, and an elder woman stepped forward, her hair white as snow, her skin wrinkled like tree bark. She carried no weapon, only a small pouch of ashes. Nalnish, Kuruk said. Oldest of us. She will question you. Nalnish's voice was dry wind through cedar branches. She spoke in Apache. Aiyana translated, a man stands at a fork in the trail. One path leads to water that will save his dying child, the other to medicine that will save his dying wife. He may walk only one path. Which does he choose? Sam stared at the snow, at his own trembling hands. Every riddle was a mirror, and this one showed him exactly what he'd lost. He chooses neither, Sam said finally. He sends his child down one path and his wife down the other. Then he walks back the way he came. If they're strong enough to walk, they live. If not, he spares them from dying by his choice. Nalnish studied him, then laughed softly, a crackling, satisfied sound. She said something to Kuruk, who nodded once. She says you answered as an Apache. Aiyana whispered, a tremor of relief in her voice. That wisdom is knowing when not to play God. Kuruk's gaze lingered on Sam for a long time before he spoke. Samuel Cross has passed the trial. He stands under Apache protection. A roar of approval rippled through the gathered warriors, spears lifted skyward. Aiyana exhaled, shoulders trembling. Sam swayed on his feet, blood drying on his skin, but he met Kuruk's eyes without flinching. The chief stepped closer. His tone softened. You think you saved my daughter, he said quietly in English. But she saved herself. She chose your fire because she knew you'd let her stand beside it, not behind it. That was her wisdom, not yours. Sam managed a faint, crooked smile. Maybe she learned that from you. Kuruk's face didn't move, but his eyes warmed a fraction. Perhaps. Or perhaps the land teaches us all the same lesson, just with different pain. He turned away, signaling for his warriors to break formation. Within moments, the valley filled with motion, horses being tethered, fires sparked, sentries posted. The Apache had come for war, but for now they would stay for counsel. Kuruk looked back one last time. When Morrison comes, and he will stand with us. Not as savior, as witness. Sam nodded. I'll stand. Kuruk mounted his horse, his cloak whipping in the wind. Then the wind has chosen sides. As the warband dispersed across the frozen plain, Aiyana moved to Sam's side. Her hands trembled as she reached for his face, tracing the bruise along his jaw. You stood like one of us, she whispered. I stood because you were watching, he replied. For a heartbeat neither spoke. Around them the camp began to hum with life fires, crackling voices, rising horses nickering softly. The land had shifted again as if exhaling after holding its breath. Above them the sun broke through the thinning mist, scattering light across the valley, like shards of glass melting into gold. Sam squinted toward the horizon. Your father said something about Morrison. Aiyana's eyes hardened. He's building a new line rail straight through the sacred springs. He's offered bounties for every Apache who resists. Sam's jaw tightened. Then this valley will bleed. It already has, she said quietly. He looked down at her hand still resting on his arm. We'll find another way. There is no other way, she said. Only the one we make. The wind rose, scattering snow into thin silver ghosts. For the first time since the war, Sam didn't feel like a ghost himself. He felt weight, purpose, and something dangerously close to belonging. The land around Bitter Creek was vast and cruel, but for that one morning under the bright, pitiless sun, it felt like a promise waiting to be kept. The sun bled itself out across the horizon, a dying ember swallowed by the ridges. The third sunset since the trial burned strange and heavy, and silence hung over Bitter Creek, like the pause before judgment. Even the snow seemed to wait. Sam stood at the threshold of his cabin, rifle at ease, but ready eyes fixed on the eastern flats where the road cut through sage and frost. Aiyana was beside him, wrapped in her red mantle, her hair braided tight against the wind. Smoke from the Apache camp curled faintly behind them, ghostly against the indigo sky. When the riders appeared, they looked at first like smudges of ink crawling across parchment. Then the shapes solidified, horses, banners, glinting rifles. 40 men at least. They moved with practiced formation boots, striking rhythm dust and snow rising behind them in a crimson haze. At their head rode Josiah Morrison, his posture regal, his purpose unmistakable. He came, Aiyana murmured. They always do, Sam replied. Kuruk's warriors had been ready since dawn. Hidden trenches cut into the ridges. Snipers nestled among pines. Smoke pits dug and covered with snow to hide the camp's size. Every shadow held breath. The Apache had not survived centuries in this desert by meeting their enemies in the open. Morrison reined in at the valley's mouth, 40 men forming a crescent behind him. He dismounted slowly like a man performing an act of theater. Even from a distance, his hat and coat gleamed, his boots untouched by mud. But his face, the face, was ruin. He's wearing a mourning band, Aiyana said, her gaze hawk-sharp. Sam squinted. His son's been dead 3 years. The grief is new, she said. He wears it like armor. She was right. Morrison's eyes carried that brittle shine of a man who had fed too long on pain and now mistook its taste for purpose. The railroad baron advanced with 2 guards until he was just outside rifle range. Sam stepped into the open boots, crunching the frozen crust. He didn't call for truce. Men like Morrison only respected silence. It made them believe they were the ones breaking it. Captain Cross Morrison called. His voice carried clean through the valley, thick with mock civility. I should have known you'd end your days hiding among savages. No fugitives here, Sam answered evenly. Just neighbors. Neighbors. Morrison barked a bitter laugh. Is that what you call the devils who butchered my surveying team? Sam's eyes stayed level. Your team that was dumping mercury into the springs. Morrison's expression twisted. Progress demands sacrifice. The Apache must learn they're ghosts of an old world. Like your son, Sam said quietly. That hit the bone. Morrison froze, then smiled, slow, deliberate, venomous. Thomas wrote me from your unit. He worshipped you, you know. Said you were the only man worth following. When he died, he was calling your name. Sam's throat closed. He remembered the boy's face, pale beneath the smoke of Elkhorn Tavern eyes, searching through the chaos for a promise that never came. Morrison's voice softened to a near whisper. He died believing you'd come for him, and you didn't. Sam had no defense. There wasn't one. He straightened. You came here for revenge. I came here for order, Morrison corrected. For destiny. I've spent 3 years building it piece by piece. He leaned forward slightly, his smile a wound. Do you think you chose this place by chance, that cabin, that ridge? Every land deed in this valley passed through my hands. I let you have it. I wanted you isolated. I wanted the killer captain and the chief's daughter penned in one neat little circle of fate. Aiyana's jaw tightened. You knew I'd come. I knew the Apache would send someone, Morrison said. You were easy to find. You're a story the newspapers love, the healer of Red Mesa. The girl who knows every herb, every hidden spring. You're not a woman, Miss Aiyana. You're a map with a heartbeat. And I intend to own you. I belong to no one, she said. Morrison's gaze slid over her, assessing cold. Knowledge has a price. Eastern universities will pay thousands for your plant lore. The War Department would kill for your water roots. If you won't sell willingly, I have other means of persuasion. There are new medicines, you know, truth serums they call them. Sam stepped forward, blocking her from view. You want me, Morrison. You always did. Let her and her people go, and I'll walk into your camp tonight. Morrison's laugh was almost joyful. You still think this is about honor. You don't understand Cross. Revenge was just the spark. Empire is the fire. The transcontinental line will cut through this valley by spring. I'll own every tie, every spike, every drop of water it crosses. The Apache, you, even the corpses under these hills, you're all just ballast beneath the rails. Built on bones, Sam said. Built on progress, Morrison corrected. Progress doesn't care whose graves it walks over. He pulled his horse's reins, turning slightly. I'll make this simple. Give me the woman and the map to the Apache gold veins. In return, I'll erase your name from every ledger. New life, new identity. Freedom. Sam's mouth twisted. You'd have me abandon her, like I abandoned my son. Exactly, Morrison said softly. You see, we understand each other. That did it. Sam's face hardened to stone. No. Morrison exhaled the sound like a door closing. Then we'll do it the hard way. He wheeled his horse and shouted to his men, The woman alive, 5,000 bonus cross, dead 10. Every Apache scalp 100. The valley exploded. Gunfire tore through the cold air, echoing off the cliffs. Morrison's men spread fast, taking cover behind boulders and wagons. But before they could entrench, the earth itself seemed to rise against them. From behind rocks, from snowdrifts, from hollows in the ground, the Apache surged. War cries split the dusk. Arrows hissed. Muzzle flashes strobed across the white plain. 6 men dropped in the first volley. Horses screamed. Morrison's line faltered. His hired guns were bullies used to weak prey. They had never faced an enemy that moved like smoke. Inside the cabin, Sam and Aiyana worked in tandem. She fired with calm precision from the window, slit her lips, moving in low chant. Sam reloaded and watched the horizon. What are you singing? He asked between volleys. Death songs, she said. So the wind remembers their names. Outside, Kuruk moved like a shadow through the chaos, directing his warriors with bird calls and mirrored flashes. Every time Morrison's men regrouped, the Apache vanished and reappeared somewhere else, striking from darkness. But Morrison adapted. He signaled, and 2 men hauled forward oil casks from the pack mules. Within minutes, fire arrows streaked the sky, landing on the cabin roof and dry brush. Flames licked upward, feeding hungrily on the timbers. Roofs caught. Sam shouted, grabbing a wet blanket. Smoke thickened, curling down the chimney. He beat the flames, coughing, barely aware of the approaching hoofbeats behind the blaze. That was Morrison's move. While the smoke blinded the defenders, he led 6 riders around the ridge, flanking the cabin. By the time Sam looked up, the door burst inward. Morrison stood framed in the firelight like a figure from Revelation, coat immaculate, pistol in hand, his men fanning out behind him. End of the line, Captain. Sam swung his rifle up, but Morrison gestured. Don't bother. You've already lost. He stepped closer, eyes glittering. Tell me something, Cross. Did you hold my boy when he died? Sam's grip faltered. Yes. Did he suffer? Sam could have lied. Yes, but he was brave. Morrison nodded once. Then he was nothing like you. The gun came up. Sam braced, then thunder filled the cabin. But not from Morrison's hand. Aiyana's rifle cracked. Morrison froze. A red bloom spread across his chest. For a moment he just stared, bewildered, as if surprised the world dared touch him. His pistol dropped. He swayed. You he whispered. Sam lunged forward and caught him before he fell. Morrison's body was heavy solid, too alive to believe it could end. His breath rasped. "You see him, don't you?" Sam said quietly. "Thomas. He's waiting." Morrison's eyes fluttered. "Thomas, he forgives you," Sam murmured. "He knows you tried." The dying man's expression softened, the rage unraveling. "Tell him—" He didn't finish. The breath left him in a sigh. Sam lowered him to the floor. The body looked smaller now, as if grief itself had held him upright all these years. Outside, the gunfire dwindled to scattered shots, then silence. Kuruk entered, snow clinging to his boots. His warriors followed, their faces painted in ash and victory. "It is done," the chief said. Sam stared at the corpse. "It's never done." Kuruk studied him. "You mourn your enemy. I mourn what he could have been." Aiyana knelt beside Sam, her hand on his shoulder. "You gave him mercy." "No," Sam said softly. "I gave him what I pray. Someone gives me a beautiful lie at the end." Outside, the night deepened. The battlefield smoked, scattered with bodies and broken rifles. The wind began to rise, sweeping snow over the dead, as if to tuck them in. Kuruk's warriors moved silently among the fallen, collecting weapons, tending their wounded. No cheering, only the quiet dignity of survivors. Aiyana stepped outside and looked east. The flames from the burning wagons lit the valley in wavering orange. "The white men will come again," she said. "They always come again." "Yes," Kuruk agreed, "but tonight the mountain breathes free." Sam followed her gaze. Somewhere beyond the ridges, beyond the reach of light, the world of railroads and politics and progress waited to swallow everything. But not tonight. Tonight belonged to the dead, and to those stubborn enough to live. He turned back toward the cabin. Morrison's body lay still near the hearth. Sam picked up the pistol that had fallen from the man's hand, fine steel initials engraved in silver. TM, the letters read. "Thomas Morrison." He set it beside the corpse gently. "He's yours again," he murmured. Aiyana watched him, eyes unreadable. "You fight like a man who wants to die, but you speak like one who's learning to live." Sam gave a tired smile. Maybe both can be true. The fire crackled behind them. Outside, the snow fell heavier, softening the hard edges of death. The valley seemed to sigh a long exhale after violence. Kuruk approached the doorway once more. "When the sun rises, we bury our dead," he said. "Then we decide what to do with the living." Sam nodded. "And after that," the chief's gaze turned toward the dark horizon. "After that, we face the Empire." As the night closed around them, Bitter Creek shimmered under the snowfall, the blood beneath already, vanishing beneath white. Somewhere out there, the iron rails crept closer, mile by mile. But for this single winter night, the land belonged again to silence, to ghosts, and to a fragile alliance born from ruin. And in that silence, Sam Cross finally understood the truth Morrison had never grasped, that the enemy was never the man across the gun barrel. It was the hunger that made men believe the land could ever belong to anyone. Morning came raw and merciless, a rim of frost glassing every sage blade and splinter of fence. In the ash of Morrison's burned supply wagons, truth gleamed the way broken glass catches dawn-rolled maps marked with rail alignments, manifests stamped with a doctor's counterfeit seal, lists of mercury, arsenic, phenol, enough poison to turn summer water into graves. Genocide laundered as industrial mishap. They spread the papers on a deerskin near the watchfire. Kuruk stood over them like a basalt outcrop, eyes dark as a storm cell. "These stores must be destroyed before another hand can use them," he said, tapping the seal with a scarred fingertip, then the line that named a depot 20 miles east. "The cache lies at their base camp." "It's a trap," Aiyana answered before the words finished leaving his mouth. Morrison never carried the only copies. Someone else knew. Someone inherits. Her prophecy barely cooled in the air before a white flag bobbed up the slope. A single rider came on with the unhurried posture of a man visiting his own bank. Sam recognized him even at distance. William Stanton Morrison's chief surveyor, 20 pounds of composure in a tailored coat. Younger than Morrison, cleaner, quieter. No fever in the eyes. Only math. "I've come for Mr. Morrison's body," Stanton announced, voice rolling like a glass marble across a table. "And to make you a better offer than the one you killed him for." Speak, Kuruk said. The railroad is coming regardless, Stanton went on. If not through this valley, then around it, which is cheaper. Morrison's fixation on this cut was personal. His eyes met Sam's. Related to you, Captain Cross. I'm not a grieving father. I'm a businessman. I propose a treaty. Apache keep their holy sites in water. We take a narrow corridor along the valley's rim. Everyone prospers. And the poison, Aiyana asked softly. The mercury, the arsenic, Stanton's blink was a bead of rain rolling off oiled leather. Already in the water, he said. Not here. Morrison wasn't stupid enough to foul his own road. Upstream at 3 of your summer camps. Slow acting. Symptoms in weeks. By then, he shrugged. Cold slid under every rib in the circle. Even dead Morrison still had a hand on living throats. The antidote, Sam demanded. It exists. Stanton turned his horse as if the meeting bored him. I know where. But this is a race, isn't it? Snowmelt will speed the spread. You have 3 days before the damage is irreversible. I'll be at Morrison's base with the antidote. Come negotiate. Bring your maps or watch your people sicken and die. When he left, the valley erupted in whispers. Knives of opinion flashed. Kidnap him. Break the answer out of his bones. Strike now. Vanish into the hills and pray. Aiyana cut through them with a blade none of them wanted to touch. We don't know which sources he fouled. There are dozens. We need him alive and cooperative. It's still a trap, Sam said. He wants us desperate enough to step wrong. Then we spring it carefully, Kuruk decided. He looked to Sam the way an old warrior studies a new kind of rifle. You know how these men think. What would you do? Sam stared at the northern rocks, where dawn stitched a thin silver seam. Split the force. One party rides openly to negotiate and draw eyes. A second circles to take the antidote out from under him. A third, he paused. A third hunts the truth, tests water, confirms what's poison. Stanton could be lying about some or all. I'll lead the water hunt, Aiyana said. I know every seep and throat of spring. You're what he actually wants, Sam told her. Morrison worshipped land and gold. Stanton worships prediction roots, seasons how to read a people's motion before it's made. The map in your head is his prize. Then he'll watch for me, she said, which means he won't see the knife in the shadow. The plan grew on deerskin in charcoal and hand signs, 3 arrows of approach. 5 bird calls, 3 smoke marks, a vow unspoken but shared, that if one prong broke, the other 2 cut deeper. They split at first light. The sky wore a scar. Sam took 10 riders through a slot canyon, so tight the horses had to move single file among them. Kajika, Aiyana's brother, once eager to spill Sam's blood, just to stop his sister binding a white man's wounds. Now riding a breast voice, still, edged but no longer a saw. My sister trusts you, Kajika said. That matters. But if you betray, I die slowly. Sam cut in the faintest twist at his mouth. Your whole family has offered me that hospitality. Kajika snorted, nearly smiling. We're protective of memory keepers. They threaded a stone throat that chopped the sun into flittering shards. The base camp lay in a natural bowl, tidy as a ledger, clever for freight, foolish for war. Stanton had drawn lines for locomotives, not ambush. We climb, Sam said, pointing at a near-vertical face. At night. In silence. You're insane, Kajika said, and something like respect sharpened the word. 300 feet. Which is why they won't guard it. Dark, dropped like a wet blanket. They wrapped cloth around boot soles, smudged pine resin on fingertips. Sam's bruised body sang with pain at each reach. His breath smoked. A single falling pebble sounded like a bell tolling all their names. When his grip slipped, Kajika's hand found his wrist with the speed of summer lightning. Don't die here, the younger man whispered. Die down there at least. There are mourners. They bellied over the rim as Kuruk's delegation walked into torchglow below. The camp lay pinned like an insect neat rows of tents, crates stenciled victuals, a field surgery stage center too lit. Stanton stood like a schoolmaster gesturing with elegant courtesy to the negotiation tent. Theater. It's a shell game, Sam murmured. The real antidote isn't here. How do you know? Kajika asked. Because his shoulders are loose, no one cradling a secret like that breathes that easy. A notation flashed through Sam's memory: secondary supplies, skeleton spring. The same clear blue he'd waded into to steep leaves for Aiyana. "We burn his market first," he said. "Make him look at fire." Kajika and 3 slipped east. Moments later, wagon rows went up like kindling shots cracking from the heights. In the chaos, Sam and the rest melted off the ridge and ran hard for Skeleton Spring. Water there poured from a split basalt lip blue-green as a tired eye. Aiyana stood knee-deep, hands in the current, as if listening to the earth's pulse. "This pool's clean," she said, "but someone's been here." Sam knelt, reading ground, the way other men read scripture: pressed grass, square heel prints, drag marks, and under a deliberately casual cairn, a wink of tin. They pried out a metal case packed in straw and wax, dozens of vials, careful labels, a surgeon's neat hand. Beneath a paper-wrapped list, only 3 sources fouled, not the dozens Stanton implied, each tagged with dose and date. "He wanted panic," Aiyana said. "Panic signs anything. Instead we have the cure and the record," Sam answered. "He has theater." They parceled vials into saddlebags, split riders to Hush Sand Powder Bowl White Navel. Aiyana worked without wasted motion, calling out dilution ratio, soak time the order to boil until bubbles looked like fish eyes, then to pray in the old language for the small fish already dreaming under black water. Watching her there, hair slicked to her temples, wrists, wet voice steady, Sam thought this was the truest country she belonged to, where earth and breath and memory braided into medicine. They were cinching cinches when scouts blurred in from the west, faces blanched under war paint. "The chief, he fell," Mosey rasped. "Not bullet. Pipe." Stanton offered ceremony. Honey on the lip, tongue numb, heart slow. The forest rocked without moving. Aiyana snatched a vial. Sam threw a saddle. They flew. In the treaty tent, Kuruk lay on his side chest, rising in shallow sips, his lips chalked fingertips, faintly purpled pupils pinched by too much light. The mesquite pipe sat on a silver tray, powder still dusting the mouth. Stanton had vanished as neatly as a shadow that knows the schedule of wind. Aiyana placed her palm on her father's brow, gentle, decisive. "Warmth holds. Pulse is there." He used a plant alkaloid cut with honey and a little whiskey to bury the scent, something that clutches the heart's road. Sam cracked the case. The doctor's Latin crawled, but his hands remembered. Dandelion root extract, activated charcoal natron brine, a bitter antimuscarinic, the frontier medic swore by. Measure mix, wait for amber. He passed it. She dosed with the same calm she planted corn exact patient. Kuruk swallowed hard, throat working, eyes clenched, as his body climbed a hill no one else could see. Kajika stood behind them, fists so tight the scars on his knuckles whitened. If he will live," Aiyana said, issuing the order to the heart itself. "His fire still answers." The chief's breath deepened by notches. Color tiptoed back to his lips, the faintest blush of sunset after a storm. The tent exhaled as one. Aiyana touched her forehead to his, whispering the child name only family can use. Then she looked at Sam. Now him. The hunt began, not with a bugle but with a scent, the ghost of cinnamon on the pipe. Axle grease and soil north of camp. Hoofprints without steel shoes, the style hired guns favored. 4 hollowed nail holes in a square heel. Sam read them like a patient page, straight for Horsehair Knoll, then dogleg east along Black Spine to a flat the freighters loved. Kajika picked 12 riders. Aiyana insisted on coming. Sam studied her. She didn't add a word. Her eyes had already given their argument. "You ride left flank," he said. "If I signal, you turn. If you signal, I'll check the wind," she replied, breaking danger in half with a sliver of humor. They moved. Dust and rime, bitter grass and hot horsehide. At White Navel, 2 warriors were already pouring cure into the settling pool. At Hush Sand, children blinked from shawls on the bank round-eyed, and an elder woman twined a rope with trembling fingers. Aiyana halted long enough to teach boiling time and leave a second vial, scrawling the dose on a flat rock in charcoal. 3 days, she said. Sleep with your ear to the ground. Water will tell you when it's well. On the slope of Black Spine, the track bent toward an old timber dump. Sam dismounted and crouched an oil paper scrap snagged on a cactus spine. He freed it half a receipt. Lodanum 2 crates, delivered Dry Fork Way Station. The words Dry Fork were smeared, but legible. He swapped horses there, Sam said. They cut across the basin. Dry Fork squatted like a tired dog, thin-walled, stable. A low house, a frayed flag, a lantern yawning in a greasy window. Opium and salted meat braided the air. A white boy of 16 swept the porch, eyes smudged by sleeplessness. 3 zebra-dun horses stop here this afternoon, Sam asked like a man checking a contract after delivery. 2, the boy gulped. 1, black, 1 roan. Coat blue. Didn't talk. Paid straight. Changed saddles. Took water. Rode northeast. Left this. He fished a cheap tin badge from his pocket security, stamped with a little track barrier. Sam slid him a coin. The boy stared at it as if it were a comet. "What are you, trash man?" Sam said. Outside, Aiyana murmured, "He want us on a false scent." "No," Sam said. "He's too disciplined to peacock." The badge fell when he rushed the change. "Means..." He lifted his face into the wind. It had shifted Earth's sweeter promise of thaw. "Means we're close enough for him to hurry." And frightened animals run to where they buried their claws. Where Kajika asked. "Third cache," Sam said. "Not base, not spring. A dry bowl deep enough to hide wheels. A place to sleep with no smoke. Saddle Hollow." Saddle Hollow was a stone cauldron with slick sides and wind that sang an old flute. They doused torches, slipped forward on breath and will. Sam lifted his palm. The line split, curving around the rim. In the dust wheel, ruts pawed earth, a smear of ash, still warm under thin sand. Opium, pipe leaf, medicinal resin, boot prints with the left toe worn thin. Inside, Kajika whispered. 2, no 3, 1 asleep, 2 awake. Aiyana laid an ear to the ground the way midwives listen for a new life. 3 breaths, 1 short, 2 long. Sam sketched 4 crosses and an arrow in the grit. "Kajika and I take the wagon. Mosi Tazi circle east. Aiyana hold the out. If he shoots you," she asked. "Then you shoot him," Sam said without looking back. "Don't hesitate." They slid in like shadows. A 2-wheeled wagon sat under a tarp, a loose scatter of crates, a pup tent with a guttering lamp. A guard dozed with his hat over his nose. Stanton wasn't here, only hands. But horses were haltered crates, laid to clear a path, and under the tarp, a long, coffin-looking chest. Alive, Sam signaled. The takedown snapped like a whip. Kajika's forearm locked the sleeper's throat. Sam pared the pistol from his hand. Eastward, Mosey booted the second man's weapon away. The third stumbled from the tent and met Tazi's knife at his throat. Silence returned, except for a wind whistling the bull's mouth like someone mocking them with a tune. Sam heaved the long lid. Not a body. Rows of metal tins labeled carbolic acid, strychnine, veterinary, and 4 big glass jars sloshing pale gold that matched the vials from Skeleton Spring. A paper tacked inside the lid read, "In case of loss, cache B, White Vulture Ridge." He split the stock, Sam said. "This is the tail. The head's at White Vulture Ridge." The captured driver panted. "Don't kill me, I just hold reins." "Where's Stanton?" Sam asked. "South. He said he'd meet me at Dry Fork, a swallow with Morrison's corpse. He needs the body to paper the banks," Sam muttered to Kajika. Then to the driver, "Any traps wired?" "No," the man squeaked. "Only a bell string east." Mosey lifted a length of twine and a tiny bell from shallow sand. "He tells true." Aiyana stepped in, eyes gracing crate list jars. She tilted 1 jar. Lamplight quivered inside the glass. "Enough to save 3 more sources," she said, "and enough evidence to shame your courts into hearing if their courts still know how to listen." Sam watched the moon skim a lace of cloud. Time ran through his fingers. "Split again. Mosi Tazi, carry these back to White Navel. Kajika, Dry Fork. Stanton won't outrun us if his luck is tied to a corpse. Aiyana." She had already shaken her head. "White Vulture Ridge," she said. "If there's another cache, I must see and seal it. Our people need to lay our own stone on that mouth." Sam weighed it. Every choice was a spike driven into earth, hard to pull once set. He nodded. "Go with Haya and Naylan. One ahead, one behind. No fire. When you see the vulture glyph white on rock, turn left." Kajika quirked a mouth corner. "White men give orders like rain falls. Sounds natural." "Keep complaining," Sam said. "It'll keep you warm." They parted. Wind flipped direction. Fine sand trembled like a horse's raised coat. Sam and Kajika swung back toward Dry Fork over ground wrinkled like a rattler's belly. Lantern light tottered on the porch. Two figures, a tall spare man, with his hat brim low Stanton, and a shorter silhouette, with a barkeep's apron. Sam stepped onto the yard with a lazy hand near his holster, and the other held empty. "You forgot to settle your tab," he said, like a man collecting on a debt with interest. Stanton turned eyes bright and cold. "I never forget." "You will," Sam said. He angled his chin toward the road, where 4 Apache shadows had folded in from the dark. "You plan to carry Morrison's body to sign your transfer papers. I have the notebooks that prove your poison scheme. I also have the antidote." Stanton cocked his head Fox, listening for a distant snare. "We're back to negotiation. What else do you need from me?" "The full list," Sam said. "And a confession. You imagine you'll harvest it with a gun." "No," Sam said. "With a clock. My people are out saving water. Every hour you stall is another mile of poison. You told me 3 days. I don't have 3. A shadow behind Stanton moved too fast. Kajika's bow thrummed first. The would-be shooter pinwheeled into a porch post pistol clanging on boards. Stanton never flinched. He looked at Sam then, at the Apache shapes mirrored in window glass. "You want to win with Virtue Cross," he said. "Railroads don't run on virtue. They run on steel and fear. And water doesn't run on fear," Sam said. "It runs on gravity. And gravity's against you." Poetic Stanton murmured, and let something small drop a paper cat. Smoke puked to life at his boots, ether stink hammering sinuses. When it cleared, he was already over the railing landing in the saddle of a dun like a stone thrown level. Ride Sam snapped. They went after him in a spray of mud and cinders, Kajika vaulting the rail with cat grace to land behind Sam and cinch his waist like a little brother bracing through fire. The night took them into its black teeth. Ahead Stanton's hoofbeats rang fast, and even no panic. He angled toward bare flats, future-railed surveyor stakes sticking up like bad teeth. Left, Kajika yelled. Cut bank Sam hauled the reins. His horse shouldered the drop. Water burst in silver stars. Stanton glanced back. Surprise flickered when he saw 2 moon-bought shadows still hanging on him. He jerked the dun's head. A wire belly. High flashed between 2 stakes. Down Sam barked. The wire hissed over his shoulders, ripping a fire line across his back. Stanton's horse cleared clean. He'd laid his own snare. Sam's mount stumbled but didn't fold. Kajika sliced the wire with his knife, and they were off again. The chase narrowed into a whale-tooth canyon. Stanton checked his horse, pivoted pistol leveled, cutting the moon into a black cross across his face. "End of the grade, Captain," he said softly. "Let's talk like civilized men." Sam stopped 10 paces out. Kajika slid left and vanished. "Speak," Sam said. Stanton lowered the barrel an inch, a polite lie. "I'll give you the full list. And the coordinates to another cache at White Vulture Ridge." In exchange, he lifted his chin. "In exchange for burying a truth with Morrison's body that you killed his boy." Sam didn't blink. "The boy died in my hands," he said. "Not because I shot him. Because I arrived late. I've told that truth to myself 1,000 times. It isn't currency." "Then let me go," Stanton said. "You have what you want." "No," Sam said. "You live. But you stand before a judge. Before women with babies at the springs." Stanton smiled like a man recognizing an old tune. "Court of whose law? The law that buys railroad shares." He angled the pistol. "You don't understand. I am not Morrison. I don't need a personal vendetta. I need a straight line. Anything in the way gets bent." The muzzle winked. Kajika's bowstring snapped drier than frost. An arrow stitched Stanton's upper arm. His gun flew. The dun reared. Sam hit him in the ribs, the two of them tumbling into sand and grit and the metallic tang of blood. Stanton bucked like a hooked bass. Sam's hands recalled field hospitals and trench wrestling. He levered the wrist, folded the elbow, pinned him with pressure and the weight of a decade. "It's over," he said, through a furnace breath. Stanton panted, laughed ragged. "Over no spring comes. Thaw carries your secrets to the river." "And we just learned to swim," Sam said, tightening, until a low cry convinced the man to stop arguing with Bone. Kajika trussed him in 3 beats, fingers quick as first rain on a skin roof. They dragged Stanton back to camp before dawn. The sky poured milk into the east. Kuruk was sitting up, eyes deep and still, as if a lake had decided to keep secrets again. Aiyana counted pulse with a fingertip, while Sam and Kajika muscled their prize into the tent. "The list," she said. Stanton bit his lip. Sam opened the satchel he'd worn tight to his chest. Inside lay a ledger in clean grid hand. Summer Camp Hush Sand Dose, 25. White Ridge, 15. Dust Bowl, 20. Coordinates, schedules. Along the margin, a spare note, Cache C, White Vulture Ridge, cave mouth like a broken smile. "My grandfather told me of such a cave," Aiyana said, translating the metaphor. "We will seal it." Kuruk stared at Stanton with the patient fury of granite. "You turned ceremony into a blade," he said. "You will speak everything before you speak to mountain spirits." Stanton looked around and aged 10 years in a blink. "You think hanging me in town undoes a railroad?" he asked, not defiant so much as tired. "Railroad isn't a man. It's a hunger. Hunger finds a road." The sentence struck Sam like a thrown stone. He remembered Morrison on the cabin floor, a counterfeit piece finally unclenching his jaw. Thomas calling his name through smoke. Spring water shivering under wind while minnows threaded mercury like beads. "Hunger finds a road," he repeated quieter. "Then we'll move the kitchen." He looked up. "We make it eat different." Aiyana raised her head. "We redraw the maps," she said. "Not theirs. Ours. Maps of water, of safe seasons, what camps must shift, when to sleep far from habit. We'll teach children to taste what wind says when it walks over poison." Kuruk squeezed his daughter's wrist, once almost tender. "And we will use their courts," he added, a sudden glint in his eyes. "Not because we trust them, because we will force them to look at their own face." Sam stared at the ledger, then at Stanton. "You're coming," he said. "You will stand before a judge, before reporters, before anyone with eyes, and you will say word by word how you meant to kill with water. If you keep silent, your dying will take a long time." Stanton laughed without breath. "You want me to speak because you believe in mercy. I'll speak because I believe in numbers. My fate weighs less than a line across dirt." "You're wrong," Sam said. "No one is a number." He looked toward the tent flap where daylight pooled like poured milk. "But men have lived as numbers, died as numbers. I'm tired of it." Outside, small parties were already writing cures to Powder Bowl, to White Navel, to Hush Sand. On White Vulture Ridge, Aiyana and Haya reached the Broken Smile cave mouth and sealed it, stone-stacked and marked with the tribe's cut jars buried deep beneath a flat slab capped with a ring of white rock, a sign that means never in, any language that wants to live. They returned with a handful of pale dust for proof. The ridge wind licked their braids and went away satisfied. When full morning came, the last slivers of snow glinted like spilled salt. A hawk crossed high and left one clipped note in the sky, a neat period at the end of a chapter that wasn't an ending. Sam walked down to the creek, where water ran between black stones, foam white as milk snagging in grass. He cupped a sip. Cold bit tongue and teeth mineral clean, no metallic echo. He shut his eyes and heard a sound like a far mother whispering. Aiyana stepped up beside him, touched 2 fingers to the current. "It's breathing again," she said. "Yes," he answered. "It's breathing again." "You'll take Stanton to court?" she asked, voice calm as a hand on a fevered brow. "I'll take him to a place with many eyes," Sam said. "Human eyes. And the lands." "And you?" she asked. "Do you breathe again?" He watched his reflection spackle together with the sky. two stubborn strangers deciding to sit at the same table. He saw a son's small face, a letter he never sent, winters he drank instead of apologizing. He spoke as if carving a date into a beam. "Not yet," he said. "Maybe starting today." Drum taps thudded faint beyond the trees, the White Vulture team returning. Kajika loped up waving. "Sealed and buried," he called. "Our mark is set. No hand will dig there." Kuruk stood in the tent door straight-backed, though a few hours earlier death had run fingers along his ribs. He looked at his daughter, at Sam, at the rider's sloughing back caked with dirt and medicine. His voice wasn't loud, but the canvas listened. "Yesterday we buried men," he said. "Today we bury poison. Tomorrow we plant." Aiyana nodded. "We plant roads no paper can steal because they live only in memory. We plant ears to hear water. We plant laws that make the strong bow their heads over a bowl of clean water before they speak." Sam tightened his horse's girth and turned to Stanton, hands bound, face shut like a ledger snapped closed. "Time to meet a different arithmetic," he said. "Numbers that cry." They rode out under a honeyed haze of evening, the dirt road stretching like an old ruler, missing half its marks. Behind them, the valley's little voice tried laughter again, after a long illness, the creek chuckling over stones. Wind curled around the direction poles and sang an ancient thing about hunters who didn't chase with teeth and claw, but with memory, patience, and truth, the only blades that stay sharp after winter. The hunt wasn't after a man on a dun anymore. It hunted an idea that land can be swallowed by a straight line. It hunted a habit, forgetting. With every hoofbeat, every drop of antidote loosed into a spring, every ring of white stones set at a cave mouth, they tore that idea. Slowly, certainly. The way water takes a mountain apart and convinces the mountain it did it to itself. They found Kuruk dying in the traditional way, surrounded by his people facing east toward the rising sun. The poison Stanton had used was elegant in its cruelty, shutting down the nervous system, slowly leaving the mind clear until the end. "Daughter Kuruk," whispered when Aiyana knelt beside him. His hand, trembling with effort, found hers. "The burden passes to you. Father, we have the antidote. Not for this poison," he said, each word requiring immense effort. Stanton was specific. "He wanted me removed, but you preserved." His eyes found Sam. "Both of you preserved. You're more valuable alive." Sam understood with sick clarity. This had never been about the railroad or even the gold. This was about control of Aiyana's knowledge of the Apache future, of the narrative of progress. "Where is Stanton now?" Sam asked Kajika. "Returned to his camp. He says he'll wait 3 days for our surrender. After that," Kajika's face was stone but his eyes burned, "he'll report that Apache attacked peaceful railroad workers. The army will come." Father Aiyana said, tears flowing freely now, "Tell me what to do." Kuruk's smile was peaceful despite his pain. "You already know, Memory Keeper. The songs continue through you. The knowledge lives. The people," he paused, breathing shallow, "the people find new paths when old ones close." He turned to Sam then. "You asked to be a bridge. Now you must be one. My daughter will need." Another pause longer. "She will need someone who understands both shores." The chief's hand rose to his neck, removing a small leather pouch on a cord. Inside was a single eagle feather, perfectly white, except for its tip, which was deep black. "This was my father's," Kuruk said, pressing it into Sam's hand. "And his father's. 7 generations of chiefs. I have no son to pass it to, and by our law it cannot go to a woman. But you," he struggled for breath, "you who have lost a son, who understand that weight." The implication was staggering. Kuruk was naming Sam as his heir, not as chief that would go to Aiyana's future husband, but as war leader, as protector of the tribe, until that marriage occurred. "I can't," Sam started, but Kuruk's grip was surprisingly strong. "You can. You must. Otherwise Stanton wins. Otherwise the people scatter like seeds in the wind." Kuruk's eyes found Aiyana one last time. "Sing me the water song, daughter. The first one you learned." Aiyana sang, her voice breaking but beautiful as her father's breathing slowed. The assembled Apache joined her one by one, their voices creating a harmony that seemed to make the very earth vibrate. Sam found himself humming along, not knowing the words but feeling the rhythm in his bones. Chief Kuruk died. As the last note faded, his face turned toward the sunrise he would never see. The morning would come later. Now there were decisions to make. Stanton must pay Kajika, said his voice thick with rage. I'll cut his heart out myself. And start a war that destroys our people, Aiyana asked, though her own rage was visible. That's what he wants, Apache violence to justify military intervention. Then what another warrior demanded. Let him win. Sam studied the eagle feather in his hand, understanding the weight Kuruk had placed on him. We use his own methods against him. Meaning, Aiyana asked. Stanton's a businessman. Everything's a transaction to him. So we make him an offer he can't refuse, not with violence, but with something more powerful. What's more powerful than violence? Kajika asked skeptically. Truth, Sam said. And the law. The plan Sam outlined was audacious, relying on Apache knowledge, military tactics, and a gamble about human nature. First, they sent the antidote with fast riders to the 3 poisoned water sources, saving those who could be saved. Then Aiyana used her knowledge to predict exactly where Stanton would want to build his railroad, not where Morrison had planned, but where it would be most profitable. Here, she said, pointing to a map, copper deposits Morrison didn't know about. Water that flows year-round, valley wide enough for a town, and Sam prompted. And it's not Apache land. It's Mexican grant territory legally owned by Don Alejandro Vasquez. Sam smiled. Who happens to hate American railroad companies after they cheated his brother? They rode to Don Alejandro's hacienda, a day's hard journey south. The old Mexican rancher received them with suspicious courtesy, until Aiyana sang him a song not Apache, but Mexican learned from his grandmother years ago, when the two peoples traded freely. You know the old ways, Don Alejandro said, wonder in his voice. My grandmother sang that song. I thought it was forgotten. Nothing is forgotten, Aiyana said, if someone chooses to remember. The negotiation was swift. Don Alejandro would claim the land. Stanton needed backing it with Spanish grant documents that predated American ownership. The Apache would support his claim, testifying to historical boundaries. In return, the Apache gained a powerful ally and access to trade routes Stanton couldn't control. But Sam knew this wouldn't be enough. Men like Stanton didn't accept legal defeat gracefully. They needed leverage. That leverage came from an unexpected source, Stanton's own men. Sam and Kajika infiltrated the railroad camp disguised as Mexican traders. What they found was dissatisfaction bordering on mutiny. Stanton had promised his workers bonuses that hadn't materialized, safety that didn't exist, and glory that turned out to be graves. He's worse than Morrison, one worker confided over whiskey. At least Morrison was honest about his hate. Stanton smiles while he plans your death. Sam made them an offer, testify about Stanton's poisoning of water sources, his murder of Kuruk, his planned genocide, and the Apache would ensure they got safe passage east with enough gold to start over. Apache gold, the worker asked skeptically. Apache friendship, Sam corrected. Worth more than gold if you're living in their territory. The climax came at Skeleton Canyon, a place whose name would prove prophetic. Stanton had agreed to meet, believing he held all the advantages. He brought 30 men, documents ready for Apache surrender, and supreme confidence that his plan had worked. He found instead a gathering unlike anything he'd expected. Apache warriors. Yes, but also Don Alejandro with a dozen vaqueros. The worker representatives Sam had turned, and most surprisingly, a federal judge from Tucson, whom Aiyana had summoned with a carefully worded telegram about water source poisoning affecting American citizens. What is this? Stanton demanded, his composure finally cracking. Justice Aiyana said simply. She stood where her father should have stood, wearing his ceremonial dress, every inch the chief her people needed. You're under arrest for murder, attempted genocide, and violation of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Stanton laughed. You can't arrest me. You're Apache. You have no authority. She doesn't, the federal judge said, but I do. And these witnesses have provided compelling testimony about your crimes. The workers Sam had turned began speaking, detailing Stanton's plans, his poisons, his murder of Kuru. Don Alejandro presented his land claims backed by documents older than American law in the territory. The Apache sang their history of the land Aiyana, translating, creating a narrative that no court could ignore. Stanton's men, seeing the tide turn, began backing away. Without Morrison's passion or money to motivate them, they had no interest in dying for a lost cause. "You think you've won," Stanton snarled, focusing on Sam. "But the railroad will come. Progress will come. Your savage friends will be swept aside like leaves before a storm." "Maybe," Sam admitted, "but not today, and not by you." As the federal marshals took Stanton into custody, his last words were directed at Aiyana. "Your knowledge will die with you. Your people will forget their songs. In 50 years, no one will remember you existed." Aiyana's response was to sing not in Apache, but in English, teaching the judge's aide a water song, watching him write it down carefully. "Memory isn't kept," she said. "It's shared. It's given freely to those who value it. Your mistake was thinking you could own what was meant to flow." Comment 5 if you're captivated by stories where love transcends the boundaries others draw. Subscribe for more tales from the Wild West, where hearts find each other across impossible divides. These are your cowboy stories. Your Wild West love. Your Wild West stories that remind us that the human heart knows no borders. 6 months passed. The snows melted, revealing a valley transformed not by rails and progress, but by something more subtle: understanding. The trading post Sam and Aiyana, established at the junction of Apache Mexican and American territories, had become a place of unexpected convergence. Built with Apache knowledge of seasonal winds, Mexican techniques for adobe construction, and American innovations in water management, it stood as a physical manifestation of what was possible when cultures chose cooperation over conquest. Sam stood in the doorway watching the sunrise paint the desert in shades of gold and rose. His morning ritual had changed. He still named his 23 dead soldiers, but now he added Kuruk's name, and Morrison's, and even Thomas's, all the ghosts that deserved remembrance, regardless of which side they'd chosen. "You're going to wear a groove in that doorframe," Aiyana said from behind him, her arm slipping around his waist. She'd moved into his space, gradually over the months, first her medical supplies, then her personal items, and finally herself. "Just thinking," he replied, about how wrong Stanton was. About memory dying. She moved beside him, following his gaze, to where children played in the courtyard, Apache Mexican, and even a few white settlers' kids, all learning each other's languages through games that needed no translation. "My grandmother would say memory is like water," Aiyana said. "It finds its own level, flows around obstacles, and nourishes what it touches." Their marriage had been a complex negotiation of traditions. An Apache ceremony, at dawn a Catholic blessing for Don Alejandro's satisfaction, and a civil ceremony to ensure legal recognition. Each had felt both foreign and right, like trying on clothes from different worlds and finding they all fit. "Riders coming," Sam noted, seeing dust on the eastern horizon. Aiyana's hand moved instinctively to the rifle kept by the door. Old habits died hard. But as the riders approached, they could see it wasn't a threat. It was Kajika, now war chief of the Apache, leading a delegation. "Sister," he greeted Aiyana formally, then turned to Sam with what might have been a smile. "Brother who stands between." It was Sam's Apache name, given after he'd negotiated a water rights agreement that satisfied both the tribe and the territorial government. Not particularly poetic, but accurate. "What brings you?" Aiyana asked. "News from the east. The railroad has chosen a different route, 60 miles south. They say it's because of the terrain, but—" Kajika shrugged, but Sam prompted. "But the new railroad president read the court records from Stanton's trial. He decided Apache territory was too legally complicated to be worth the trouble. They all understood what this meant. It wasn't permanent victory, nothing ever was. But it was time. Time for the Apache to adapt, to learn the white man's law while maintaining their own. Time for children like those playing in the courtyard to grow up bilingual, bicultural, capable of navigating both worlds. That evening, as they often did, Sam and Aiyana climbed to the ridge overlooking the valley. The setting sun turned the desert into a canvas of impossible colors: purple shadows, orange cliffs, red earth slowly cooling to blue. "Do you regret it?" Aiyana asked. Choosing this over solitude, Sam considered. His cabin still